Basically speaking, I thought I would tackle the subject of whether the Bank of England is fit for purpose. And the reason I wanted to do this is to show all the enormous number and magnitude of the discrepancies between what they say is the theory and what is the fact, and what they say countervailing theories say and what they actually say, and what the facts are compared to what they say the facts are. Now this is a pretty poor catalogue when you're basically trying to run the nation's... it works sometimes and not other times. So I'm starting with a chart that I've lifted shamelessly from Tim's work, but I think it's a really important point to make, that if, as Andrew Bailey claims, the causes of inflation in the UK and in Europe and in America were due to exogenous supply shocks, then obviously, you know, they're blameless. The problem is that these exogenous supply shocks were global. COVID was global, Ukraine war impacts were global. So how does he explain, well, he doesn't bother trying, but how would he explain the fact that if this is, by the way, is the blue line is the UK RPI, partly because I did this on a longer term time frame previously, and partly because it goes much higher than CPI. And the other three lines show the annual inflation rates for Switzerland, Japan, and China, all of whom share the planet with us, all of whom are subject to the same exogenous shocks, none of whom basically had any recognisable abnormal inflation. So that's the first thing. It's not exogenous. It must be endogenous. Surely that's self-evident. Better than that, the Bank of England, which asserts the right to be identified as the author of this book, even though it's actually written by two of their thrusting junior economists, wrote a book, published this book, in fact, in May 2022, basically a how-to guide to, patronisingly telling the little folk what economics is, what we know about it, why we know that, and how therefore to manage the economy, money supply, etc. The publication date's interesting. It was 19th of May 2022. RPI by that stage had hit a new 42-year high of 11.7%. So obviously delaying publication of your manuscript can actually make the egg on your face more substantial than you were expecting. Anyway, all the way through this, I've got quotes. These quotes are all taken from this book. I've just put them in quotation. I haven't bothered to say they're all from this book, unless stated otherwise. And I want you to think about what they're saying and how it reflects what's going on compared to reality. So the first thing we're going to talk about is money supply. They basically say in the book that we used to look at money supply after the work of Friedman and Schwartz, and subsequently Milton Friedman on his own, would look at these things and establish the relationship between money supply and inflation. And then they say that actually it started to break down. They mention at one point in the book in the 1980s and another point in the book in the 1990s, which is quite interesting, since they don't seem to be aware of the fact when it broke down. So basically speaking, we did have some periods where where money supply growth, which is the red line, did move up more than inflation, which is the RPI, which is the blue line. However, there were very good reasons for when this happened. It happened in the early 70s, it happened in the late 70s, early 80s, oil crises both, you will note, and it happened in the great financial crisis. So when you have a crisis and the value of other assets, thank you very much, other assets plummet, guess what do you decide to do with your demand for money? Well, it kind of goes up because everything else is being wiped out. So in actual fact, it's quite straightforward and we have a reasoning for it. Here, for example, is what happened in the 80s, because that circle I had in the previous chart shows the really big effect in the 1980s. And what happened in the 1980s? Well, in the 1980s, the inflation-adjusted value of anyone who had any UK shares was pretty much annihilated. So if you thought you had a pension that had shares in it, or you thought you had some wealth that, because of your shares, you didn't. So guess what you did with your money? You hoarded more money because you were really worried, and that didn't feed through to inflation because you weren't going to spend it. So these things are all pretty explicable, and anyway, they're a misquote. So I wasn't going to read any of the quotes, but I have got a quote in my pocket I'm going to read, because it is relevant, which is that Milton Friedman said that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. And everyone usually stops quoting it there, but it's very important to read the rest of this same sentence, in the sense that it is and can be produced only by a more rapid increase in the quantity of money than in output. In other words, we're not talking about the relationship of money supply to GDP. we're talking about the relationship of money supply after you've deducted real GDP. So there's a non-inflationary amount of money supply growth, which is determined by real GDP, and then there's the inflationary bit on top. So you have to have this adjusted money supply. Now this is the chart of the UK adjusted money supply compared to RPI. I'm sticking with RPI as a theme here. And you can see that the adjusted money supply growth, which is the red line, and RPI, the blue line, see how this relationship broke down in the 1990s? No, you can't see it, I can't see it either. Didn't break down at all. There was a little bit of disruption, obviously, in the 1980s, but anyone who lived through 1974 and then the second oil crisis in the early 80s will tell you that you really shouldn't take that as anything other than a complete outlier. For the whole of the rest of the time, we appear to have a very reliable, by economic standards, relationship of excess money supply growth against inflation. And indeed, when we had this massive increase in excess money supply, that led to a very big biggest rise in 45 years or so of inflation. So they're talking nonsense. And they must be aware they're talking nonsense, but they've been so conditioned by, firstly, academia, and then subsequently going to the Bank of England when no one says, you really should check this stuff, that they actually write it. And quite happily, and Andrew Bailey wrote the foreword to this book, so Andrew Bailey not only agrees with this book and everything it says, he signed off on it. So then we come to velocity. So if the velocity of money is unstable, as the Keynesians say, this is the body of evidence since the 1980s. It's shown that velocity can change a lot. Well, I don't see it changing. I see a very, very steady trend. The only exception being 1980, so end of 70s, after the oil crisis, where again, as I said, there was evidence that people would be incentivized to and were money hoarding. Otherwise, you have an incredibly reliable, long-term, tightly bounded velocity of the UK. This is nothing to do with theory. This is as close as we get to fact in macroeconomics. And you also see what happened to velocity during the COVID crisis, as it were. We gave everyone lots of money and restricted their ability to spend it, so therefore the relationship between money and GDP, with money shooting up and GDP going down, we had this big drop in velocity, and then velocity has been surging back ever since, because of course, the Keynesians, I've read this, and I found this in a textbook, the Keynesians genuinely believe that money created by the monetary authority cannot, I quote, find its way into the real economy, without being aware that it's found its way into the real economy the moment you did QE. Unbelievable. Anyway, so here's a few more things about the nice juxtaposition here between Ben Bernanke. Charlie Bean made a very similar point when the UK started QE, that it's not Banana Republic stuff or monetisation because it's only going to be temporary. And as Friedman warned us, there's nothing so permanent as a temporary government measure. So and here we still are with all the QE that we ever used. So this is the QE money created. In this instance, I've switched to the Federal Reserve, just because I happened to be on that page at the time. But you can see what the old trend was, and the fact that we're 5 times the trend of the money supply growth that the Fed had been doing before it invented unconventional monetary policy, which you can bet your bottom dollar is now basically conventional. So what else did the Bank of England have to say and learn? So they're still arguing that there's no real relationship between the quantity of money and inflation. But what if they're wrong? I mean, presumably they're monitoring this stuff on a daily, one would hope, basis. How long did it take them to realise that printing money seemed to actually have supercharged inflation? I mean, in the markets, we were talking about every day. So how long did it take them to realise and go, hold on a second, has someone still left that brick on the accelerator? Well, 9 months. So for 9 months, they watched inflation shoot off as a direct response with around about the 12-month or a little bit more than the 12-month lag from the printing of the money. And it still took them 9 months to go, Jesus, was that us? We better at least stop doing that before they stop doing it. And that's how wedded they are to their theories over the empiricism or someone else's theory. Can't bear to admit that the monetarists might have had it right. So when do we get to the crossover point? This is what John was talking about, and I'm looking at another way of measuring that. If you look at the relationship between money supply and nominal GDP, so it's really more important to look at nominal GDP rather than real GDP when we look at the impact of the money, because obviously the money hits prices if it's not hitting real. And you can see that on the trends, we're heading for a crossover point, i.e. where the nominal GDP catches up with all that money we printed. We know that money supply growth in the US has been negative for 18 months. Problem is that instead of the economy slowing down, which it would normally, it's not normal. We have a massive overhang of the money that was printed before that. Now, working out when that overhang is used up is fraught. So this is my best attempt at trying to work out when the overhang gets used up, i.e. when do these two things that were in line for a sustainable period before COVID come back into line. For everywhere, ECB, Europe, UK, US, it's sometime in the fourth quarter, give or take. And it's difficult to be more precise than that. It depends at what speed nominal GDP starts running out of steam, at what speed money supply declines, continues to decline. But it's soon. And what John was saying about 2024, I think is going to be absolutely right. You know, don't forget that the nominal GDP follows this red dotted arrow up until the point that it hits and meets the constraint imposed by money supply growth. Then it turns on a pivot and follows the blue dotted arrow. And with very little warning. It's just very hard to say exactly when, but I'm saying November 2023 because I'm an idiot. Heisenberg's uncertainty principle told us that you could say what's going to happen or when it's going to happen, but not both. So then we have a look at the dear old Bank of England. What do they say? Well, in a fantastic bit of hubris, they basically say that, you know, we're great, you can trust us, we're amazing, and we basically keep inflation at a healthy level, they say. So this is inflation at a healthy level, according to them, on their watch, while they're doing it. I was thinking when everyone was talking about central bank digital currencies and the concerns that the authorities might abuse their position. Let's backtrack a bit. What about the concern that the authorities don't have a clue what they're doing and they're idiots? What about that idea? So I'll give you an example. In the UK, it is estimated, according to a report that was commissioned by the Treasury, that a very small amount, it's something farcically low, like sort of, you know, sub 5% of the entire UK economy is grey economy, by which they mean people who aren't paying tax. What's currency in circulation in the UK? I'm taking a wild guess. Everyone here is largely white, middle class, middle age, wearing expensive jackets and close to retirement, which means you've done all your wealth accumulation throughout your lives, so you probably have more money than you ever had at any time in your life up to this date. And I'm also going to take a wild guess and say you've probably got around about 200 quid at home. But UK money supply is equivalent to £4,000 per household. 4,000. That's notes and coins out there. In April, around about April, May of 2020, exactly the time when the government thought the economy was going to implode, and they also thought people would stop handling cash because of the fear of transmitting COVID, notes and coins in circulation went up by 10% in the space of 2 months. So you suddenly had this massive increase in this excessive amount of money supply. And what do we think the velocity of cash in circulation is? Well, I mean, it doesn't higher than 1, might be 12. I mean, who knows? I once counted up and I got to nearly 20 different services that my family uses or has used at different times where they take predominantly cash. And during COVID, that escalated. Every hairdresser was closed down, but every employee of the hairdressers just went to people's houses rather than doing their work. So basically speaking, they don't have a clue what the grey economy size is. They don't have a clue, even when the data's readily available to them, they don't have a clue what they should be measuring. They don't have a clue whether money supply is or is not important. But let's get to see what the Bank of England has to say about all these things. So basically speaking, remember that the Bank of England's view is that monitoring money supply isn't important and that the impact of money supply doesn't have any effect on, well, anything, but particularly not on inflation. Yet when they're discussing QE, the Bank of England economists, trying to explain it in the simplest terms possible to the general public, say that in the case of QE, we have our finger on the printing press, and it makes sense to increase the amount of money if you think inflation is going to be lower than it should be. Well, why would it make sense to do that if money supply and inflation are not related? It doesn't make sense. And you just told us that. But now you're saying the exact opposite. And then it says, but we wouldn't do too much, because if inflation got too high, printing would become a problem and has a cost to the public. Yes, it's called a cost of living crisis, and you caused it. Quite extraordinary, though. They don't seem to be aware of any of these inconsistencies in their story. They also say that if central banks would continue to print more and more without limit, the result would be too much inflation. So they're talking at complete cross purposes to the way they talked earlier, and they're about not acknowledging that there's any relationship. Andrew Bailey presumably didn't even read the book, but he did write the foreword, which sounds a lot like he's signing off on it. So it looks like the Bank of England, this result of too much inflation, is exactly what happened. They printed money without really any sort of control, even though there wasn't actually a reason to do that. They had limited temporarily economic activity, and they printed money even though they were going to let people do economic activity again. So inflation went shooting up, and now it's going to come down because they're, as John said, having used too much accelerator, they're now using too much brake. So the interesting thing about QE is, has it ever done any good? The productivity crisis in the UK occurred around about the time of the financial crisis. Since then, the Bank of England has used QE to basically dig the government out of a hole, to allow them to treble the size of government debt as a percentage of GDP, and to do what? There's been no actual improvement in the economy to speak of since before the financial crisis. So QE hasn't done anything at all. It doesn't work. And if either QE works and their theory is wrong, I would quote Ben Bernanke's joke that the problem with QE is that it works in practice but doesn't work in theory. Well, you know, quite clearly then their theory is wrong. Or, to take it even more extreme, QE doesn't actually work in a real economic growth sense at all. It's just a nominal tool. Anyway, so this is the disclaimer. This is the bit you really should read. Much more interesting than anything else. And I retire hurt, and we'll take questions later.